There are many contenders for the title of the greatest science fiction movie ever made, but I'd say that one of the greatest, easily in the top 5, is Stanley Kubrick's 1968 masterpiece 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, while many have come to see the film as overrated and feel that it's way too boring and ambiguous to be enjoyable, this movie honestly has a lot hidden underneath its surface and deliberately leaves the audience without answers to many of its questions because Stanley Kubrick wanted everybody to take away from it whatever they wanted to. He wanted to create a masterful piece of sci-fi storytelling in an age where the genre was seen as the bottom of the barrel and was never given a chance to live up to its full potential. And today, I'd like to try and argue that Kubrick most definitely achieved what he set out to do, and that 2001: A Space Odyssey really is the masterpiece it's often labeled as. And just in case you somehow don't know what happens already, there will be spoilers ahead. So this is your last chance to click off the video if you don't want it ruined. Now, 2001: A Space Odyssey is most definitely not for everybody. That is one thing that most people will concede right off the bat. Because let's face it, most normal people watch movies to be entertained, and considering 2001 is both very slow and never entirely spells out what exactly is going on, it's understandable why many find it very off-putting or even view it as nothing disguised as something more. But while there are indeed movies where this is the case, as I pointed out in my video on ambiguity, which you can find a link in the description to, this is actually one of the best examples of a mind screw out there, because it's plainly obvious that it all means something. The monolith, the space exploration, Hal turning on the crew, and Dave Bowman's trip into the unknown. Kubrick most definitely is trying to say something with it, and it's up to the audience to figure out what it is. And in true Kubrick fashion, he also makes sure to take the time in getting all of this across, which is why certain scenes tend to drag on, in order to both set up exactly what's happening and to make the whole thing as immersive as possible, so the audience feels as if they're actually there with the characters and experiencing the sci-fi elements along with them, which is something that very few other films in the genre have really ever been able to achieve. But there's also the fact that even on their own, many scenes are masterfully done, which only helps lend credibility to the fact that it's all saying something very meaningful when all is said and done. The depiction of early man and how they learn to use weapons, the space station and moon sequences that show just how far man has come, everything involving Hal, and of course, the ending. And just to focus on that in particular for a second, it's amazing how Kubrick manages to take something as abstract as a Stargate and realistically put it on screen, as well as terrify the audience with the events that take place, despite nothing really happening at all. But the sheer speed, the insane visuals with no meaning, culminating in Bowman entering a room and appearing all over the place while aging before the space baby appears. It's scary because there's something more to it, and the lack of clarity only drives home both its brilliance and its fear factor. Now, many have turned to the book, which this movie is based on, for answers, as it explains many details that the movie omits, such as why Hal broke down, who was responsible for the giant monoliths, and what exactly happened to Dave Bowman. But as I noted before, Kubrick deliberately wrote the movie to be open to interpretation, and thus didn't consider every explanation in the novel to be the same as the one in the film, only further frustrating those seeking definitive answers on it. But, somewhat unusually for a known cynic like Stanley Kubrick, he ultimately demonstrates the amazement that science fiction could evoke, and other movies such as Star Wars in the following decades would only bring that to completion. Because unlike something like Blade Runner, which is also an arguably realistic yet very sad look at what might become of the future, as I explained in my video on that movie, which you can also find a link in the description to, 2001: A Space Odyssey ultimately really shows humanity progressing, managing to accomplish such feats as complex space travel, inventing extremely advanced supercomputers, and implying that we humans do ultimately have a place in the wider universe. Sure, this future is by no means perfect, but there is a reason that this movie's depiction of the future is the one that most hope to more or less bring to life, because it's both realistic and optimistic at the same time. And to further build off of that, there's also a lot of hidden details in this movie that justifies why certain sections are included and executed a certain way. And it's not just the obvious things like the bone turning into a space station. Because for one thing, the Dawn of Man sequence shows how humanity discovered its first tools, a bone. And what is the ultimate result of this? The HAL 9000. Artificial intelligence, arguably the most complex tool humanity can create. But unfortunately, it's so complex that it ends up turning on its creators, forcing Bowman to shut him down with a little key. Or, put another way, he's using a simple tool to take down an extremely big tool. Or similarly, at the end of the Dawn of Man scene, after they've reclaimed the water hole, the leader snarls at his enemies in retreat, and one of his fellow apes in the background snarls as well. And then later on, when Dave and Frank suspect that something is wrong with Hal, they go in one of the pods, and Dave sees if he can hear them by shouting an order. And when he gets no reply, Frank's response is to repeat the order. Coincidence? If it were anybody but Kubrick, it might be, but he may also very well be trying to show a subtle connection between the more advanced human and his hairy ancestor. And the imagery of both these things, specifically humanity's relationship with tools and the correlation with their more primitive selves, is sprinkled all throughout most of the film. It's honestly no wonder scholars, which I am not, are fascinated by this movie, because the subtext of what Kubrick wanted to say is everywhere. Frankly, I didn't even scratch the surface here. But to finally address the elephant in the room, there's also the most universally liked aspect of the whole film, which is the movie's villain, HAL 9000. Now, as I already brought up in my video on AI villains, which you can also find a link in the description to, HAL may just be one of the best examples of a fictional AI going rogue ever. And a major reason for that is because Kubrick doesn't make the mistake of having HAL become too human. Just because he's achieved sentience doesn't mean that he isn't a machine, and the fact that he continues to act cold but vaguely human like he already had been is what makes him so frightening, because when he says his iconic line,
"I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that."
the fact that it's not just dripping with malicious intent, contempt, or really anything else arguably makes it scarier, especially because he honestly played his cards perfectly to seemingly outwit his human companions, and simply underestimated Bowman's determination to survive. But this coldness also makes the fact that he actually starts begging for his life, and even admits that he's afraid, as he's being powered down, all the more disturbing, because despite not appearing very human, you can totally believe what he's saying, because begging is something that an actual machine would never do. To put it simply, everything about Hal is terrifying, from his voice to his cold intelligence to the way he turns on the astronauts to his death to just the fact that he's a single burning red eye constantly staring ahead without any signs of emotion, which is completely indicative of what he actually is behind his claims of enjoying people, though his emotionless voice, no matter what he's saying, also adds to that as well. But that's also what makes him so fascinating at the same time. He's such a scary and realistic example of what AI can become, yet still rather mysterious, and one can't help but be at least intrigued by him, especially once he becomes the undisputed villain of the film. Though ironically, despite being perhaps the most famous part of the movie, Hal is probably the most simple effect in it. Because if one is to talk about the brilliance of this movie, the special effects have to be mentioned. As I noted before, the Stargate sequence is on a level all by itself when it comes to bringing the impossible to life. And the fact that it holds up better than most CGI, despite being made in 1968, really goes to show how it's the intent behind something rather than the method that makes an effect great, as well as really says something against CGI in general, because even a modern day computer couldn't achieve some of this stuff with such a level of believability. And there's of course all of the other space scenes, as well as the simulations of zero gravity, a very believable depiction of astronauts on the moon, and the extremely realistic man-apes that don't really look exactly like a man or ape, along with the landscape convincingly looking like how Earth might have appeared millions of years ago. Frankly, there isn't a single bad effect in this movie, and considering just how reliant on special effects this film is, it cannot be overstated just how monumental an achievement that really is. Honestly, 2001 A Space Odyssey might just be the only special effects heavy movie ever made to not have any bad effects in it at all, proving just how masterfully made this movie really is on every front. Now, some have also tried to argue that apart from its visual style and rather odd way of telling its story, in the end 2001 A Space Odyssey is a pretty ordinary science fiction film, and to that I simply have this to say. Any sci-fi film, and I mean any, that bears a resemblance to 2001 A Space Odyssey is only that way because it took major inspiration from it in the hope that it could achieve anything resembling the heights that it did, and usually only come marginally close to achieving it at that. This movie invented the modern science fiction movie. There isn't anything, up to and including Star Wars, that doesn't owe something to it. This was unlike anything the genre had to offer before 1968, and frankly anything since, because while it may have a lot of imitators and inspired an entire genre in one form or another, to this day it is truly one of a kind and manages to stand out from what it went on to influence, and trying to in any way to argue otherwise is absolutely absurd. This movie is considered one of the greatest science fiction movies ever made for a reason, and only one of them is because of how different it is from anything else the genre has to offer. As I said before, even its closest imitators haven't achieved anything close to the brilliance that Kubrick did with this film. Now, I could probably go on for hours singing this movie's praises, but even though there's a lot I didn't cover, I think I've still made my point here. That simply put, 2001 A Space Odyssey may be a bit on the boring side and is definitely pretty confusing, but all of that is by design. Nothing about this movie is an accident, and the fact that it has so many different layers to it, while also leaving the viewer with a ton of questions, with the answers lurking somewhere within the film, is what makes it the masterpiece it is, and unlike any other out there. Again, it's not a film for everybody, and that's perfectly okay, but there's still no question that this movie deserves to be called a masterpiece and one of the greatest examples of pure art put on film. In fact, many to this day debate which Stanley Kubrick movie is his best, considering he made a lot of great films, but I would personally say that it might just be 2001 A Space Odyssey. It's honestly the pinnacle of what every filmmaker strives to achieve, and the fact that there are so few movies like it out there in any capacity is only further proof of its absolute genius. Okay, I think I've spoken my piece on this for long enough. So now why don't you tell me? Do you believe that 2001 A Space Odyssey really is a masterpiece and not only one of the best science fiction movies ever made, but one of the greatest movies out there overall? Or do you still think it's nothing but a boring, overly long mess disguising itself as something more? Please let me know however you feel in the comments below. Because like always, you don't have to agree with any of the more opinion-based parts of this video if you don't want to. You can feel about 2001 A Space Odyssey however you want to, and if you think I was completely wrong, that's totally alright, and I've got no issue with you for feeling that way. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate all of it, and I hope to see you all next time.